a figure who has apparently sat on the empty throne for centuries and whose combat abilities are so far beyond what anyone in the story previously represented that characters who were previously considered top-tier threats are being tested in entirely new ways just by being in proximity to this conflict. And then there's Loki, the accursed prince of Elbaph, a giant among giants, a figure so monstrously powerful that the narrative framing Oda gave him upon introduction was not just hyperbole for flavor, but a deliberate calculated statement about where this character sits in the global power hierarchy, and most people glossed over it when it first came up, which is honestly one of the biggest analytical mistakes the community has made in recent memory. But here's the crazy part: the introduction of characters like Loki and the confirmation of Imu's combat capabilities doesn't just raise the ceiling of the One Piece world abstractly, it creates a concrete scaling ladder, a chain of power comparisons that, when followed carefully from link to link, leads you directly to a conclusion about the Yonko that the manga has been quietly assembling for years. And Elbaph is the arc where Oda finally handed us the final piece. And what makes this even more significant is that we also have Shamrock Figureland entering the picture as a character whose very existence connects multiple threads of the Final Saga's power narrative together. The Figureland family, St. Garling, the God's Knights, all of these forces represent the world government's answer to the question of who they send when they need someone capable of genuinely threatening the most powerful pirates alive. And the fact that characters like Shamrock exist at this level of the story tells you that the power ceiling being established right now is the highest it has ever been in One Piece history. This changes everything about how we scale the Yonko, because you can no longer just compare Shanks to Luffy or Blackbeard in isolation. You have to factor in where they all stand relative to this new landscape of threats. And when you do that, when you actually trace every comparison Oda has given us, one name rises above all the others in a way that the manga has now made undeniable. Let's talk about Shanks, because if you want to understand why the Elbaph reveal matters so much, you first have to appreciate the extraordinarily deliberate way Oda has handled this character across the entire series. Because from the very beginning, Shanks has been positioned not just as a powerful pirate, but as the benchmark by which power in One Piece is measured, the standard against which all others are implicitly compared. When Oda re-established the Yonko in Chapter Y 1053 after the events of Wano reshuffled the entire power structure of the world, Shanks was the one constant. Whitebeard was gone, Kaido and Big Mom were defeated and fallen, Buggy took a spot through sheer narrative absurdity, and Luffy and Blackbeard rose to claim the remaining positions, but Shanks had been there through all of it. The longest-standing emperor of the new era, the one figure who had never lost his position, never been challenged successfully, never been depicted as anything other than an absolute pinnacle of human achievement in this world. And most people ignored this detail, the fact that Oda has spent the better part of 3 decades writing Shanks as a character whose full power is perpetually withheld, perpetually teased, perpetually hinted at without ever being fully revealed, is not an accident, and it is not a coincidence. It is one of the most purposeful narrative decisions in the entire manga, because Oda is saving Shanks' complete power expression for the moments in the Final Saga where it will have the maximum possible emotional and narrative impact. Think about every scene where Shanks' power has been glimpsed rather than shown, his presence alone stopping the Marineford War, his conquerors, Haki clashing with Whitebeards and shaking the entire ship while the sea itself split apart around them, his casual, effortless dispatch of Eustace Kid in Wano despite Kid being a Yonko-level combatant at that point, and the way every single person in that scene reacted to it as though they had witnessed something fundamentally beyond their comprehension. But here's what this all builds toward. The question was never really whether Shanks was strong, because every piece of evidence in the manga has been pointing toward him being extraordinarily powerful for 25 years. The question was how strong relative to the other Yonko in the current era, and that is the question that the Elbaph Arc has finally definitively answered through the most important scaling feat in the entire Final Saga. Shanks' reputation, his influence, the way even enemies speak about him in hushed tones that they don't use for anyone else. These aren't narrative flavor. They're Oda planting flags in the story and saying, pay attention to this. This matters. This is telling you something true about the power hierarchy of this world, and the Elbaph Arc is the moment where all of those flags get connected into a complete picture. Now we arrive at the heart of everything, the feat that once you fully understand its implications makes the entire scaling argument click into place with a clarity that is almost jarring. Because the defeat of Loki by Shanks is not just a plot point, it is one of the most consequential power statements Oda has ever written into the series, and the community at large has not given it nearly the weight it deserves. Let's establish who Loki actually is, because his introduction framing is everything. When Oda brought Loki into the story as the accursed prince of Elbaph, he didn't present him as a strong character or even as an exceptionally powerful character. He presented him as a world-altering force of nature whose existence posed a genuine threat to the stability of the entire planet. And that framing is not hyperbole when you consider that we are talking talking about a giant of Elbaph, a nation whose warriors are considered the strongest in the world, even by figures who have spent decades dominating the seas. The term world-destroying potential being applied to Loki is something that should have stopped every power-scaling analyst cold the moment it was written, because One Piece does not throw that kind of language around casually. The series is extremely deliberate about how it describes power levels through character, statements, and narrative framing, and when Oda tells you through the narrative that a character has the potential to destroy the world, he is placing that character in a tier that only a handful of figures in the entire story have ever occupied. And this is where things get serious, because Scopper Gaban, one of the former members of the Roger Pirates, and a figure whose combat resume places him firmly in the upper echelons of One Piece's power hierarchy, made a direct statement confirming that no one could defeat Loki except Shanks, and I need you to sit with that statement for a moment and think about what it actually means in the context of the One Piece world's established power landscape. Scopper Gaban is not a character who makes careless claims about combat potential. He has sailed with Roger. He has fought at the highest level the previous era had to offer, and he has lived long enough to witness the rise of the current generation of powerhouses. So when he looks at the available forces in the world and concludes that Shanks is the only one capable of defeating Loki, that is a statement grounded in genuine, experienced assessment rather than simple admiration. But most people ignored this detail. They heard the statement, noted it, and then moved on without fully processing the logical chain it creates, because what Gaban's statement actually does is establish Shanks as the upper bound of the combat hierarchy, above everyone else who might have theoretically contested Loki, which means every other Yonko, every other world-class combatant, every other figure who might have been in the running for that position was implicitly placed below Shanks in the same breath. And then Shanks actually does it. He defeats Loki, converting the statement from theoretical to confirmed, which is a level of narrative follow-through that Oda doesn't always provide so directly. And the fact that he did provide it here in Elbaph of all places tells you that this fight and this outcome were designed specifically to function as a power-scaling anchor point for the Final Saga going forward. The defeat of Loki by Shanks is not incidental to the Elbaph Arc. It is the arc's central power statement, the fact around which every other power comparison in the Final Saga's remaining story is meant to orbit. And once you understand that, the rest of the scaling argument becomes almost self-evident. Here is where the scaling chain becomes something truly remarkable, because the Elbaph Arc didn't just give us Shanks defeating Loki, it also gave us a direct combat sequence involving Loki and Nerona Emu, and the implications of that sequence for the overall power hierarchy of One Piece are absolutely staggering once you trace them carefully to their logical conclusion. In chapter 1181, we see Loki in direct conflict with Emu, and what happens in that sequence is not what you might expect. From an encounter between the king of the world and a character being tested against their limits, Loki tanks attacks infused with Conqueror's Haki and Omen power, which are among the most destructive forces the series has ever depicted. And he does not crumble, he does not fold, he withstands them and pushes back in a way that demonstrates genuine competitive capability against one of the most terrifying forces in the entire story. The technique specifically referred to as Sword of Judgment, Nemesis being survived by Loki, is a feat that deserves its own dedicated moment of analysis, because Emu's combat power is framed in the narrative as something categorically beyond what any ordinary force could withstand, the kind of power that makes admirals and Yonko alike look like they're operating at a lower level of existence. And Loki not only taking that technique but continuing to function as a combatant afterward tells you something crucial about exactly how powerful he is in absolute terms. But here's the crazy part. If Loki can withstand Emu's most destructive techniques and push back against the king of the world with genuine force, and Shanks is confirmed as the only person in the world capable of defeating Loki, then what does that tell us about the level at which Shanks is actually operating? The logical chain here is unavoidable. Loki can contest Emu at some meaningful level, which places Loki at an extraordinarily high tier of absolute combat power, and Shanks is confirmed to be above Loki, which means Shanks's true level is not just very strong Yonko, but something that operates at or above the level of figures who can contest the king of the world himself. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean Shanks beats Emu. That comparison is more complex and involves narrative considerations beyond pure power scaling. But what it does confirm with the kind of ironclad logical consistency that power scaling debates rarely achieve is that Shanks' combat ceiling is so far above what the other current Yonko have demonstrated that the question of who the strongest emperor is becomes almost secondary to the larger revelation of how genuinely transcendent Shanks' power actually is. And this is the point where most analysis of the Elbaph Arc stops, satisfied with having established Shanks as powerful. But the real insight goes deeper than that, because the Emu versus Loki sequence isn't just a power demonstration, it's Oda methodically placing benchmark in the story so that when Shanks' final complete power expression arrives, the audience will have the context to understand exactly how significant significant what they're witnessing actually is. With all of those pieces in place, let's now do what the title of this video promised and actually compare all of the current Yonko against this framework, because the argument for Shanks isn't just about his own feats, it's about how every other emperor measures up against the same standards, and when you look at all of them through the same lens, the conclusion becomes genuinely inescapable. Start with Buggy, because as much as the narrative has leaned into his improbable ascension to Yonko status for comedic and thematic purposes, no serious power scaling analysis can place Buggy in the same conversation as the others when it comes to raw combat capability. His status as an emperor is almost entirely a function of the people around him, his historical connections, and the absurd comedy of his situation, and Oda has been careful never to actually present him as a combat threat at the level his title would imply. Then there's Luffy, and this is where things get more interesting and more nuanced, because Luffy with Gear 5 is genuinely one of the most spectacular displays of power in the entire series. His fight with Kaido demonstrated that he can reach heights that most characters in the story could never approach, and his awakening as a sun god is a transformative ability that changes the rules of combat in ways even seasoned veterans struggle to adapt to. But here's what the current manga has been honest about in a way that some fans don't want to acknowledge, which is that Gear 5 is extraordinarily taxing, that Luffy's stamina is a genuine and significant limiting factor, and that the most important growth arc for his character is still ahead of him rather than behind him. Blackbeard is the most complicated case because Blackbeard is explicitly framed as a character who has not yet reached his peak. He has 2 devil fruits, an unprecedented level of ambition, and a power set that theoretically has an extremely high ceiling. But the key word there is theoretically, because the manga has been consistent about depicting Blackbeard as a figure who is still ascending, rather than one who has arrived at his final form, and a character who is still growing is not the same as a character who represents the current maximum of what is achievable. This changes everything about the comparison. When you look at all 4 Yonko through this framework, Shanks is the only one who is not limited by incomplete development, comedic deflation of actual power, or stamina-based ceiling restrictions. And when you combine that with the Loki scaling chain we established earlier, the logical conclusion that Shanks is currently the strongest Yonko is not just a reasonable interpretation of the evidence. It is the only interpretation that accounts for all of the evidence simultaneously without requiring you to ignore any piece of it. Part of what makes Shanks such a uniquely interesting case for power scaling analysis beyond just the feats and statements is the specific composition of his abilities, because Shanks is not strong in the way that most top-tier One Piece characters are strong. He is strong in a way that reflects the absolute mastery of fundamentals, rather than reliance on any single overwhelming ability, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding his ceiling. The most striking thing about Shanks when you look at him as a combatant is the complete absence of a devil fruit in a series where the most powerful characters have almost universally drawn tremendous strength from their devil fruit abilities, from Luffy's sun god, Nika awakening, to Blackbeard's dual fruit monstrosity, to Big Mom's soul manipulation, to Kaido's mythological dragon transformation. Shanks stands alone among the top tier as someone who has achieved emperor status and the scaling feats we've discussed entirely through mastery of the physical and spiritual disciplines that One Piece's power system is built upon. His observation haki has been stated to extend into the future, the ability to see what has not yet happened, which is the pinnacle of that particular haki discipline and a capability shared only by a handful of characters in the entire series, each of whom represents something exceptional and extraordinary about what the human potential in One Piece can achieve, and the fact that Shanks possesses this at a presumably advanced level given his experience and natural talent places his sensory and predictive combat capabilities at the absolute apex of what is theoretically possible. But his Conqueror's haki is where things get truly remarkable, because Shanks's usage of advanced Conqueror's haki infusion, coding his attacks in the spiritual force that only those with the will of a king can wield, places him in the same category as Roger and Whitebeard, the 2 figures who defined the ceiling of the previous era. And the fact that his shockwave-based sword techniques are described and depicted in ways that evoke comparison to those legends tells you exactly what narrative tier Oda is positioning him in, and this is where things get serious. The combination of future sight observation, advanced Conqueror's infusion, masterful swordsmanship developed over decades, and zero devil fruit dependency means that Shanks has no exploitable weakness in the conventional sense, no power source that can be negated by seawater, no transformation that can be disrupted, no special condition required for his abilities to function at maximum capacity, and in a world where every other top-tier combatant has at least one structural vulnerability in their power set, that absence of weakness is itself a form of strength that doesn't show up on any tier list but absolutely shows up in actual combat. Now here's the part of this conversation that I think matters more than the ranking itself, because if you followed the argument this far and you're thinking that the story is simply going to confirm Shanks as the strongest and leave it there, I think. You're missing the larger narrative architecture that Oda has been constructing, because Shanks being the strongest Yonko right now is not the conclusion of this story. It is the setup for something even larger. The final saga of One Piece is not going to end with Shanks at the top of the hierarchy unopposed. The entire thematic structure of the story is building toward Luffy surpassing every figure who came before him, including Shanks, and the fact that Shanks is being established so clearly as the current peak is almost certainly intentional, because Oda is calibrating the height of that mountain so that when Luffy climbs it, the achievement feels proportionate to what it actually represents. But here's the crazy part. There's also the question of Blackbeard, who is explicitly being positioned as the anti-Luffy of the final saga, the dark mirror to the story's protagonist. And if Blackbeard has not yet reached his peak and Shanks is currently the established ceiling, then the narrative is essentially telegraphing that Blackbeard's eventual peak will challenge or potentially match that ceiling, setting up a three-way conflict at the top of the world's power hierarchy that Oda has been building toward for literally decades. So yes, Shanks is the strongest Yonko. The Elbaph Arc has confirmed it through a scaling chain that is more logically airtight than almost anything else the fandom has been working with, but that confirmation is also the beginning of the most important power escalation in the series' history, and knowing where the ceiling is right now makes the journey toward breaking it feel that much more significant. When you step back and look at everything the Elbaph Arc has given us, the introduction of Loki as a world-altering force, the confirmation through Scopper Gaban's statement that only Shanks could defeat him, the direct combat data from Loki's confrontation with Imu, and the defeat of Loki by Shanks that converts all of that into confirmed scaling, what you're seeing is not just a power statement. It is Oda executing on a narrative plan that has been in motion since the very first chapter of One Piece. Shanks has always been the shadow on the wall of this story, the figure standing at the end of the corridor that Luffy has been running down since he was a child, sitting in a barrel watching a red-haired pirate laugh at the sky. And the Elbaph Arc is the moment where Oda finally turned the light on so we could see exactly how tall that shadow is, and the answer is taller than most people were prepared for. The fact that this confirmation comes not through Shanks fighting another Yonko or defeating an admiral, but through a chain of comparisons that connects him to figures like Loki and by extension Imu, the most powerful forces the current One Piece world has produced, is a testament to how carefully Oda has been constructing this argument across hundreds of chapters, placing each piece exactly where it needs to be so that when the picture finally resolves, it resolves completely. Shanks stands at the peak, not just of the Yonko system, but of the known pirate world, and the Elbaph Arc has made that case in a way that no amount of debate can undo, because the evidence isn't interpretive anymore, it's structural, and the structure points in one direction and one direction only. This is not just the strongest Yonko being confirmed, this is Oda telling us exactly how high the ceiling is before the final saga tears straight through it. But I want to leave you with the question that's actually going to define the rest of this story, because now that we know where Shanks stands and we understand the scaling chain that places him there, the real debate isn't whether he's the strongest Yonko right now, it's whether anyone can surpass him before the story ends. Luffy's growth trajectory has always been pointed at Shanks. That's literally where the story began, with a kid watching a man he wanted to surpass sail away into the horizon, and the Elbaph Arc might have confirmed Shanks's peak just in time for Luffy's final ascent to begin, which would make this not an ending but a beginning. Blackbeard has not yet shown his ceiling, and if that ceiling is as high as the narrative has been implying, then the question of whether Shanks remains the strongest by the time the final chapters are written is genuinely open in a way that makes every upcoming arc feel like it could be the one where everything changes. So let me ask you directly, do you think Shanks holds that position through to the end? Or is the Elbaph Arc's confirmation of his power actually just Oda setting him up to be surpassed by the time the final war is over? Let me know exactly what you think in the comments. Drop a like if this breakdown hit different than the usual power scaling content, and subscribe because the Elbaph Arc is not done delivering revelations, and neither are we.